It is 1888 in the heart of the Northwoods of Wisconsin. The temperature has plummeted to 40 degrees below zero and a blizzard rages. 100 men are miles from the nearest town, surrounded by a seemingly endless expanse of snow and ice. Their only shelter is a long, low building made of rough-hewn logs, a structure that stands between them and certain death. How did these men, with only hand tools and raw determination, build a shelter that could withstand the brutal northern winter? What were the ingenious techniques they used to stay warm when the world outside was a frozen hellscape? And what was the one critical element of bunkhouse life that determined whether a man would live or die? This is the story of the lumberjack bunkhouse, a testament to human ingenuity and the will to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Part 1. The Anatomy of a Bunkhouse. A team of lumberjacks arrives at a new logging camp in the fall of 1890. The air is crisp and the leaves have already fallen from the trees. Their first task is not to cut down the towering white pines, but to build the camp itself. The most important building, the one that will be their home for the next 6 months, is the bunkhouse. The foreman, a grizzled veteran of a dozen logging seasons, directs the men. They select the straightest, tallest pine and spruce trees, felling them with crosscut saws and axes. The logs are then skidded to the building site by teams of powerful oxen. The men work with a sense of urgency, knowing that the first snows of winter are not far off. The typical lumberjack bunkhouse was a long, rectangular building, usually about 30 feet wide and 60 to 80 feet long. It was constructed from the materials at hand, the very trees that the lumberjacks were there to harvest. The walls were made of logs, often 12 to 18 inches in diameter, that were notched and fitted together at the corners. The most common notch was the simple saddle notch, which was easy to cut and provided a reasonably tight fit. Each saddle notch was cut to a depth of 3 to 4 inches, creating a secure interlocking joint that could withstand the tremendous weight of the log walls and the lateral pressure from settling. The selection of logs was critical to the success of the building. The lumberjacks chose straight, sound logs with minimal taper. White pine was preferred for its workability and insulating properties, but spruce and balsam fir were also used. Each log was carefully peeled with a draw knife to remove the bark, which would otherwise harbor insects and promote rot. The logs were then seasoned for several weeks, allowing them to dry and shrink before construction began. The foundation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of construction in the frozen north. With the ground frozen solid to a depth of 3 to 4 feet, digging a traditional foundation was impossible. Instead, the lumberjacks used a technique called mudsill construction. Large, flat stones were placed directly on the frozen ground at 8-foot intervals along the perimeter of the building. These stones, each weighing 200 to 300 pounds, served as foundation pads. On top of these stones, the first course of logs, called the sill logs, was laid. These sill logs were the largest and straightest in the entire structure, often 20 inches in diameter and perfectly straight for their entire 30-foot length. The gaps between the logs were chinked with a mixture of moss, mud, and wood chips to keep out the wind and snow. This chinking process was an art in itself. The lumberjacks would first stuff the gaps with long strips of sphagnum moss, which had natural antiseptic properties and excellent insulating qualities. Over this, they would apply a mortar made from clay-rich soil mixed with chopped straw or wood chips. This mortar was worked into every crack and crevice, creating an airtight seal. In the coldest camps, a final layer of pine pitch was applied over the chinking, creating a waterproof barrier that would last through the harshest winter storms. The roof was the most critical part of the structure. It had to be strong enough to support several feet of snow and waterproof enough to keep the men dry. The roof was typically a simple gable design with a steep pitch of 45 to 50 degrees to shed the snow effectively. The ridge beam, the backbone of the entire roof system, was a massive log, often 24 inches in diameter and running the full 80-foot length of the building. This ridge beam was supported by a series of vertical posts, called king posts, spaced every 12 feet along the length of the building. The rafters were made from smaller logs, typically 8 to 10 inches in diameter, that were notched to fit over the ridge beam and the top plate of the wall. Each rafter was carefully shaped with a broadex to create a flat surface on the top side. The rafters were spaced 24 inches on center, creating a strong framework capable of supporting a snow load of up to 40 pounds per square foot. The roof decking was made from rough-sawn planks, typically 1 inch thick and 12 inches wide. These planks were laid perpendicular to the rafters and nailed in place with square-cut iron nails. Over the planking, a layer of birch bark was laid as a moisture barrier. Birch bark was an excellent choice for this purpose, as it was naturally waterproof and flexible enough to conform to the irregular surface of the planks. The roof itself was covered with a layer of tar paper, a heavy waterproof material that was a relatively new invention in the late 19th century. This tar paper was made from cotton or jute fabric that had been saturated with coal tar, creating a flexible waterproof membrane. The tar paper was laid in overlapping courses, starting at the bottom edge of the roof and working upward. Each course overlapped the one below it by at least 6 inches, ensuring that water could not penetrate the joints. The tar paper was held in place by a layer of sod or earth, which provided additional insulation and protection from the wind. This sod layer was typically 4 to 6 inches thick and was carefully laid to create a smooth, even surface. The weight of the sod, approximately 80 pounds per square foot, also helped to hold the tar paper in place during high winds. In some camps, a final layer of split cedar shingles was laid over the sod, creating a roof system that could last for decades. The floor of the bunkhouse was often nothing more than the frozen ground itself. In some of the more permanent camps, a rough-sawn plank floor might be installed, but in the temporary winter camps, the men slept on a bed of packed earth. This was not as uncomfortable as it sounds. The frozen ground was as hard as concrete, and a thick layer of straw or pine boughs provided a comfortable and insulating mattress. The interior of the bunkhouse was a single, large room. Along each of the long walls were 2 tiers of bunks, simple wooden frames that held a mattress of straw or pine boughs. Each bunk was just big enough for one man, and the men slept packed together like sardines in a can. A typical bunkhouse could sleep 80 to 100 men. In the center of the room was a large cast-iron stove, the only source of heat in the entire building. A long bench, known as the deacon seat, ran the length of the room in front of the bunks. This was where the men would sit in the evenings to talk, smoke, and repair their gear. Part 2. The Battle Against the Cold. It is the middle of January, and the temperature has not risen above 0 in a week. Inside the bunkhouse, the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. The men are gathered around the stove, their faces illuminated by the red glow of the fire. The stove is a massive cast-iron box, 4 feet long and 3 feet high, and it is glowing red hot. The firebox is crammed with logs, and the stovepipe, which runs the length of the building before exiting through the roof, is radiating a tremendous amount of heat. But even with the stove roaring, the corners of the room are still cold enough to freeze water. The central stove was the heart of the bunkhouse, the single most important piece of equipment for winter survival. It was a simple, robust design, built to burn large logs and to radiate as much heat as possible. The typical bunkhouse stove was a massive cast-iron box, measuring 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet high. The firebox could accommodate logs up to 3 feet in length and 12 inches in diameter. The stove was designed with thick walls, often 1/2 inch of cast iron, which absorbed heat during the day and continued to radiate warmth long into the night. The stove was positioned in the exact center of the bunkhouse, equidistant from all the bunks. This central placement ensured that heat was distributed as evenly as possible throughout the long, narrow building. The stovepipe, made from sheet iron and measuring 8 inches in diameter, ran the full length of the building before exiting through the roof. This long run of stovepipe acted as a massive radiator extracting every possible BTU of heat from the exhaust gases before they escaped into the cold night air. The stove was kept burning 24 hours a day, consuming an enormous amount of fuel. A typical bunkhouse stove burned through 2 to 3 cords of wood per week, requiring a constant supply of dry, seasoned hardwood. The preferred fuel was sugar maple, yellow birch, and beech, woods that burned hot and long with minimal smoke. The wood was cut to precise 3-foot lengths and split to a diameter of 4 to 6 inches, the optimal size for efficient combustion. It was the job of the chore boy, the youngest man in the camp, to keep the stove fed. This was a critical responsibility that required skill and dedication. The chore boy would wake up every 2 hours throughout the night to add wood to the fire, ensuring that the men would not freeze in their sleep. He learned to read the fire, to know exactly when to add fuel and how much to add. Too little wood and the fire would die down, allowing the temperature in the bunkhouse to drop dangerously low. Too much wood and the stove would overheat, creating a fire hazard and making the bunkhouse unbearably hot. The chore boy also maintained the banking technique, a method of keeping the fire alive through the long winter nights. Before going to bed, he would rake the coals to the back of the firebox and cover them with a layer of fine ash. This ash acted as insulation, allowing the coals to smolder slowly through the night without flaming up. In the morning, he would rake away the ash, add kindling and fresh wood, and blow on the coals to restart the fire. A skilled chore boy could keep a fire alive for weeks without ever letting it go completely out. The stove served multiple purposes. It provided heat, of course, but it was also used for drying clothes. A network of wires and ropes was strung above the stove, and from these hung a forest of wet socks, mittens, and long underwear. The air was constantly filled with the steam of drying wool, a smell that was as much a part of bunkhouse life as the smell of wood smoke. Ventilation was a major problem in the bunkhouse. With 100 men packed into a single room, the air quickly became stale and foul. The only ventilation came from a few small windows, which were often nailed shut to keep out the cold. The result was an environment that was not only unpleasant, but also unhealthy. The close quarters and poor ventilation made the bunkhouse a breeding ground for disease, and outbreaks of influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis were common. Despite the hardships, the men found ways to stay warm. They wore layers of wool clothing, which provided excellent insulation even when wet. They slept under heavy wool blankets, often 2 or 3 to a man. And they relied on the simple, primal warmth of the fire. The stove was more than just a source of heat. It was the social center of the bunkhouse, the place where the men gathered to share stories, play cards, and forget about the cold and the darkness outside. Part 3. The daily grind of survival. The morning alarm is the sound of the camp cook banging on a steel triangle at 4:30 a.m. The men roll out of their bunks into the cold, dark room. They dress quickly, pulling on their layers of wool clothing. Breakfast is a hearty meal of pancakes, salt pork, and coffee, eaten in the mess hall, a separate building from the bunkhouse. By sunrise, the men are in the woods, ready for another 12-hour day of hard labor. They work in temperatures that would send most people scurrying for shelter, their beards and mustaches frozen solid, their fingers and toes numb with cold. Life in a logging camp was a relentless cycle of hard work, punctuated by brief moments of rest and simple pleasures. The men worked 6 days a week, from sunrise to sunset, in all but the most extreme weather. Their work was physically demanding and dangerous. Felling a 150-foot white pine with a crosscut saw was a monumental task, and a single mistake could be fatal. The food was the fuel that kept the men going. A lumberjack burned an incredible number of calories each day. Estimates suggest between 4,500 and 6,000 calories. And the camp cook was one of the most important men in the camp. A good cook could attract and keep a good crew of men, while a poor cook could cause an entire camp to shut down as men left to find better food elsewhere. The food was simple but plentiful, designed to provide maximum calories and nutrition with minimal preparation time. Breakfast was typically pancakes, salt pork, and coffee. The pancakes were made from a simple batter of flour, water, and baking powder cooked on a massive griddle that could produce 200 pancakes at a time. Each lumberjack would consume 8 to 12 pancakes, along with 1/2 pound of salt pork and several cups of strong black coffee. The salt pork was cut into thick slabs and fried until crispy, providing the fat and protein needed for the day's work. Lunch was eaten in the woods, a cold meal that had to be portable and nutritious. The typical lunch consisted of thick sandwiches made from homemade bread, cold roast beef or pork, and cookies or donuts for dessert. The sandwiches were wrapped in oiled paper to keep them from freezing solid, and the men would often warm them by placing them inside their coats next to their bodies. The cookies were made with lard and molasses, ingredients that would not freeze even in the coldest weather. Supper was the main meal of the day, a hot, hearty meal designed to replace the calories burned during 12 hours of hard labor. The typical supper consisted of roast beef or pork, mashed potatoes with gravy, baked beans, bread and butter, pie or cake for dessert, and tea or coffee. The portions were enormous by modern standards. Each man would consume 1 to 1.5 pounds of meat, 2 pounds of potatoes, and a full pie for dessert. The camp cook worked with a crew of assistants called cookies, who helped prepare and serve the massive quantities of food required to feed 100 hungry men. The cooking was done in a separate building, the cookhouse, which was equipped with a massive wood-fired range and ovens capable of baking 50 loaves of bread at a time. The cookhouse also contained a root cellar dug deep into the frozen ground, where perishable foods like meat, butter, and vegetables were stored. In the coldest weather, this root cellar maintained a temperature of 32 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to preserve food, but not so cold as to freeze it solid. Sunday was the only day of rest. The men would use this day to wash their clothes, repair their gear, and write letters home. It was also a day for socializing. The men would gather in the bunkhouse to play cards, tell stories, and sing songs. Music was an important part of bunkhouse life, and many of the men were accomplished musicians, playing the fiddle, the accordion, or the harmonica. Despite the camaraderie, life in the bunkhouse was not easy. The men were isolated from the outside world for months at a time. They lived in close quarters with 100 other men, with little privacy and no creature comforts. The work was hard, the conditions were harsh, and the pay was low. But for many men, it was a life they chose, a life of freedom and adventure in the great Northwoods. Part 4. The End of an Era. The spring thaw has arrived. The snow is melting and the rivers are beginning to break up. The logging season is over. The men pack their belongings and say their goodbyes. Some will return to their farms and families. Others will follow the log drive down the river, a dangerous and exciting job that will take them to the sawmills of the South. The bunkhouse, which has been a hive of activity for the past 6 months, is now silent and empty. It will stand empty through the summer, a lonely sentinel in the forest waiting for the return of the lumberjacks in the fall. The era of the traditional logging camp was a relatively short one, lasting from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. The development of the logging railroad and the internal combustion engine made it possible to transport logs more efficiently, and the need for large, isolated winter camps declined. The old bunkhouses were abandoned, left to rot in the forest. Today, very few of these original bunkhouses remain. They were built to be temporary structures, and they have not withstood the test of time. But the legacy of the lumberjack and the bunkhouse lives on in the folklore and the history of the Northwoods. The stories of Paul Bunyan, the legendary lumberjack, are still told around campfires. The songs of the lumberjacks are still sung by folk singers. And the spirit of the lumberjack, the spirit of hard work, self-reliance, and a deep connection to the natural world, is still a part of the American character. The lumberjack bunkhouse was more than just a building. It was a symbol of a way of life. It was a place where men from all walks of life came together to face the challenges of the wilderness. It was a place of hardship and camaraderie, of danger and adventure. It was a place where boys became men and where the story of America was written in the heart of the frozen forest. If you want to learn more about the tools that the lumberjacks used to build their world, be sure to watch our video, 7 Essential Survival Tools That Kept Frontiersmen Alive, Part 2. And for a look at another iconic structure of the American frontier, check out The Evolution of the Log Cabin, From Simple Shelter to Masterpiece. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time on Wild America.